The town I grew up in is quite small, with maybe 50,000 people in it at once. It has all 4 seasons, but the winters and the summers are equally brutal. Most of the population seems to be the older generation, and there isn't much to do. That's probably why every so often, one of the younger generation will overdose on drugs. Sorry to say, there just aren't enough activities to do. I'm taking a sociology class this semester in college, and one of the main reasons for deviant behavior is simply not having enough socially acceptable things to keep busy. Makes sense, I guess. After I graduated high school, I moved to a much larger city in the state where the population is closer to 1 million. It was quite the culture shock at first, but I adjusted relatively quickly. That is to say, I only cried about wanting to go home for about 6 months. After that, I picked myself up and got a number of different jobs while I thought about what I wanted to do with my life. I'm still not sure what the answer to that is yet, but bear with me, I'm working on it. I've always been the aggressive sort. No nonsense bullshit flies by me. And while I've certainly never been in a bar fight or anything like that, I always thought that in those fight or flight situations, I'd go down swinging. Well, at least it almost happened like that. I came back to my hometown to visit my grandparents. They raised me since my parents decided partying was better than being parents. And while my grandparents weren't always the best, they still loved me. So I come back maybe once or twice a year and stay with them. It's nice to have them baby me once in a while, even though back then I couldn't stand it. My sister Jade still lives here, since she's still only 15, and I don't want her living with me. She's one of those dramatic gothic teenage girls that wears way too much makeup and thinks swearing like a sailor is cool. So did I, but I digress. After a day of spending time with childhood friends and catching up with all the gossip, I heard the news that one of the girls I went to high school with had been found dead. The family just asked for privacy, and nothing about foul play was said. I don't know what happened to her, and I won't ruin her memory by coming up with theories. She was cool, a very pretty girl that I didn't know very well, but I know she didn't deserve to have her life end so soon. You would think that after hearing something like that, I would be smart enough to keep my own guard up. As a young woman myself, it is best not to get too comfortable in vulnerable places. My grandparents, as always, went to bed pretty early. My sister was still somewhat awake, texting in the dark with her friends when I got up and decided what I needed was some of the fresh mountain air. It snowed today, and it's damn cold, but it never snows where I live now. Instead of bothering my grandparents by going out the back door, it's located right by their bedroom, I went out the front. Again, mostly elderly people live in this town, and this neighborhood is no exception. I think perhaps 2 children, not including my sister, live on this street. So I relaxed. Out the front door I went and sat on the little porch. I brought a couple of jackets, but it wasn't long before my legs were shaking and my fingers were numb. I loved it. You're probably sitting there thinking I'm insane, and I probably am. I was thinking about sticking my fingers in the snow, just to remember the texture of it. I heard a few twigs snap, and I didn't think anything really strange about it at first. The driveway is incredibly open, and I could have seen if anything came up or down the street. Coyotes live in this area, and so do stray cats. Neither are particularly big threats to me, a big, scary human. I didn't think anything was wrong until my legs suddenly stopped shaking, and I wasn't shivering. My body went completely still, and it was like the cold didn't bother me anymore. I heard a few more snaps to my left. I turned to look, ready to use my phone as a flashlight, when a flash of movement in the corner of my eye got me just as the porch light above me went out. Yeah, that fight or flight bullshit. I never stopped to consider the third option. Freeze. And that's exactly what I did when I saw the thing running at me, like a deer in the damn headlights. You know those urban legends like Slender Man and Bloody Mary? This one was like the Rake. If you don't know what that is, don't look it up, because it's creepy as fuck. This thing that ran at me on all fours was humanoid. All the light I had to see by were from a streetlight about 40 feet away, and the moon. It hit me with the force of a large dog, and my head smacked sharply against the brick wall behind me. Fingernails, no, claws, dug into my side as this thing mauled me. As soon as it hit me, though, the next instinct kicked in. The one I had always known I had inside me, thank God. We went through a mighty struggle, but fuck this thing. It had a loud, guttural moan in my ear the entire time. Whatever I did, punch, kick, claw, it never made this thing need to catch a breath. If you've ever played Half-Life 2, it sounded exactly like the poor guys taken over by the head crabs. If not, here's a link. If I had anything in my bowels, they would have been deposited directly into my pants just hearing it. It, he, or whatever seemed to have clothes on. A drugged-up homeless man, maybe. It reeked of rotting meat, and that smell still clings to me now. In my hair where it moaned, I'm sure smells the worst. Suddenly it reared back, and I remember I still had the use of my lungs as it raised its gnarled hand, claws curling towards me. I screamed with the volume of a siren. That seemed to startle it, as it shut up for a moment. In the dimness I could tell what facial features it had, if any. There wasn't even a glint where its eyes should be. We stared each other down. I opened my eyes to scream again, hoping my sister wasn't as deaf in her sleep as she used to be. The monster leapt off of me and dashed away on all fours. The moaning started up again, and I sat there and listened to the sound of it until it faded. My phone lay a few feet away. The screen cracked, but still functional. I didn't know I was bleeding until the red liquid smeared across the screen. Adrenaline, I tell ya. When I hit call, all of my injuries seemed to hit me at once, and I was vaguely aware of the small puddle of blood around me. The police and ambulance actually got there pretty fast. I sat outside, unable to get up. I did try to call my sister a few times. When that didn't work, I dialed the house phone. It didn't even ring. I reached vainly for that little doorbell button, but it seemed too far. The paramedics told me I blacked out a bit, and they had to struggle to rouse me. When I did come to, my grandparents and sister stood a few feet away holding each other. Police took my statement, but they gave me looks that suggested they would be put into the too crazy to believe folder. The blood, it turns out, mostly wasn't mine. There were some deep gouges left in my right side that needed stitches, and a bite mark on my left shoulder. Other claw marks and bruises are covering me, but they think I'll survive. They still took me to the hospital to be sure, and they even ran some sort of scan to check my head when I told them I hit it pretty hard on the brick wall. They gave me the all clear, and my grandparents drove me home. They all settled back into bed somehow. It's about 4 in the morning, so the sun rises in a couple hours. My grandparents own an old house, so sometimes it adjusts. These are usually small groans, but a couple of them have been loud cracks by the window at my head. I keep assuring myself that that's all they are, and I definitely don't hear scratching on the glass. Whatever that thing was, surely it had enough. You ever work a night shift? I used to. Emphasis on the past tense. These days I spend my nights behind 4 locks. The whole room lit up like Times Square. I worked retail, forcing a smile, while elderly people screamed at me, demanding I sell them shit they didn't need. A dead-end job to be sure, but we all have to eat, don't we? Yes, yeah, we all have to eat. Anyway, retail. They had me closing, making sure everything in the store was ship-shape for the freight crew that arrived every day before dawn, while the manager that had drawn the short straw for the night sat in the back, counting the money. It was a tedious position, to be sure, but most folks were too lazy to come in and terrorize us service reps at 10 o'clock at night. Most folks, anyway. That night, I finished my duties early and found myself staring at my phone, counting the minutes, the very seconds until I could lock up, listening to the exact same 3 Iggy Goddamn Azalea songs on the store radio for the millionth time today, when I heard the rattling grumble of the automatic doors sliding open, a sound that kicked my heart somewhere down into my lower intestine, even as a hot spike of irritation flared up in my stomach. After all, the store was open 13 goddamn hours a day, and this jackass needed some pens now. I grit my teeth, twisted my lips up into that tried and true customer service rictus, and turned to face the jackass in question. It only took one look at our would-be customer to wipe that smile off my face. Lurching through the doorway was a hunched and pallid figure, so entirely swaddled in a great and shaggy fur blanket that I couldn't see anything of flesh but for the angles of their gaunt face. It was a frightening visage, to be sure. Their chalky white skin stretched tightly over the ridges of their skull, framed by a greasy his stringy mop of jet black hair, a complete lack of color and depth shared by the fur, so deep that the light from the fluorescence seemed to recoil from the shambling figure. Sunken eyes, a surprisingly bright green, for the discolored bags hanging beneath them swiveled in their sockets, nearly independent of one another, until both focused on my hypnotized person. Pale lips stretched wider than I'd ever thought possible, pulling their flesh taut to the point I was fearful that their face might actually tear, revealing rows of discolored and crooked teeth. Was I afraid? Disgusting is more the word I'm looking for. Then, not sure if I was looking at a man or a woman, even now that thing's gender escapes me, so much as a corpse. Still, I'd been trained well, and our visitor was still not the most grotesque customer we'd ever had. I swallowed, clasped my hands, and recited like a good employee. "Thank you for coming in. What can I help you find this evening?" The customer said nothing at first, despite the obvious spark of comprehension lingering in their eyes. They shuffled forward, approaching me with an unbalanced gait, still grinning like a lunatic, as that bright gaze darted to and fro about the store. Eventually, they focused on, you guessed it, a box of pens sitting by the register, and the rope parted around where I imagine my stomach would have been. From the depths emerged a thin, bony hand, waxy flesh sagging off their arm like jowls, as long, twitching fingers clutched at one of the pens. Their eyes swiveled, inspecting the length of the instrument before focusing unsettlingly on me once more. Their mouth open, and following a rattling intake of filtered air, they spoke. "How much?" the customer croaked. The volume took me aback. Their gravelly inquiry was not particularly loud on its own. The words cut like a knife in the sudden quiet of the store. The music had cut out, replaced with an ominous static drone. Strange. Normally the managers would let us know if they were changing the station, but maybe Jerry had forgotten. I blinked, resisting the urge to scratch at the goose flesh running up my arms in wake of the quiet, or point out the bright yellow label announcing the pens. Sale at 99 cents. Instead, I politely replied, "Those are on sale for $1 right now." It blinked, almost comically slow, and put the pens back before shuffling on towards the sales floor. I shivered and ground my teeth, glancing at my phone to reveal, yes indeed, there were only 2 minutes to closing. "Hey G," I whispered into the radio. "Somebody's just came into the store. Kind of scary. You want me to kick them out?" To my chagrin, my manager tiredly replied, "Unless they're breaking displays, we don't ask customers to leave. Just give him an ad, answer his questions, and get him checked out." Disgust and irritation mixed in my gut like oil and vinegar, leaving me sour throughout. One look after that shapeless mass of fur, and my skin prickled anew. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that it was almost payday. I grabbed a newsletter and plastered that smile on my face once more. I found the customer scrutinizing a few computer monitors, glassy eyes trailing after the digital fish, filling the screen with almost childlike wonder. "Excuse me," I started, and they jumped, whirling around to focus on me as those lips stretched sickeningly taut against their teeth. I shivered, in spite of decorum. "Wow, we've got a pretty big technology sale this week. If you're interested, here's one of our newsletters." I recoiled slightly as they bent over to inspect the paper, dilated pupils swiveling in their sockets. In the next moment, they jerked back up, bulbous eyes continuing to survey me now of all things. God, those eyes. They were sickeningly hypnotic, a nearly radioactive green that held you hostage with their depth. Feeling their gaze on my person left me with a tightness in my chest and a clammy apprehension, like if I'd fallen into something toxic. I wanted to look away, but yet I dreaded losing sight of the decrepit creature for even a few moments. "How much?" they rattled. As I opened my mouth to answer, I noticed a flash of color past their shoulder. In spite of my fears, I glanced up and paled as I saw the computer monitors flickering, bouncing between the company logo and some horrifying twisted mash of red and white. Was that blood? "How much?" the customer repeated, and my eyes snapped back to them. I blinked, swallowed, and replied, "It's a newsletter, sir. Or ma'am. It's free." I said the words carefully, a suspicion growing oily in my gut, while their crooked grin began to grow. I understood in a more sinister light. Moments passed like hours, with silence stretching between us, dread paralyzing me as it seemed to loom larger in that heavy coat. The silence was finally broken by a tiny klaxon blaring from my pocket, alerting me to the official closing time. Frantically, I reached down and silenced the alarm, stammering, "Excuse me, I need to lock up," before darting away, pointedly averting my eyes from the flickering screens throughout the building. I kept a brisk stride all the way to the door, dread percolating in my gut. The thought of those glassy eyes appraising me afar so hungrily, the punky odor wafting through those crooked teeth, surrounded by images of gore. And was it me, or had they seemed to be growing for a few seconds there? "Jerry, I'm locking up," I hissed into the radio, "but that guy is still here, and he's really creeping me out." "What's he doing?" came my manager's reply. I reached the door and flipped the switch, shutting off the motor before twisting the lock shut. It's not what they're doing so much as, I don't know, I really don't feel safe. He or she, I don't know, they're just, "How much?" The rasping croak lifted hairs in the back of my neck as if they'd been whispering right on my flesh. I jumped and spun around, and they were right there, only a couple of feet away, and still grinning like a lunatic. I tried to back up, and found only the door at my back. "How much?" they repeated, sliding a bit closer. I stammered, my blood pounding in my ears. "I don't understand." "How much?" Closer, I don't understand. How? Excuse me. I looked past my aggressor to find my manager a few feet behind us both. At 6'6", Gerald was the tallest employee at the store and built like a truck. Once a guy had tried to rob us, and Jerry had hit him so hard he was laid up in a hospital for a month. Most took one look at him and paled, and anybody working the night shift with him usually felt totally secure. I wish I could have said so myself that night. As soon as Gary announced himself, the customer turned around, unnaturally. Their unseen feet stayed rooted right in front of me, but his body twisted like an ungainly worm, swiveling their pallid rictus around to face my would-be rescuer, his mouth falling slightly agape at the serpentine display. "How much?" they queried. "Sir, ma'am," Gary replied shakily, "you are harassing my employee. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The customer twisted further around, facing the manager fully, while I scrambled away from them, heart booming in my ears and sweat beading on my forehead. How much, they insisted in that same pleasant croak. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police." The customer began to advance, somehow making Jerry seem very small in comparison. "Gee," I whimpered, "get away from him, her, it." "How?" they rasped. "Much." Gary had started to back away by now, all the blood having drained out of his face, even as he was transfixed by those glassy fish eyes. He swallowed, still backpedaling. "If I give you a price, will you leave?" My insides went toxic the moment the words left his mouth, a feeling made worse by the sight of the customer's ever-widening smile. "Gee, don't!" I cried desperately, but Gary didn't answer. Terror clearly had his feet rooted, blocking out anything that did not assist in ridding us of the intruder. "How much?" they asked. Gary licked his lips, his breathing audible and desperate. 20, no, $100. And God, what happened next? I'd been right. It had been growing. The moment the number left my manager's lips, the customer's fur swelled and stretched, buoying its pallid face upwards towards the height of the ceiling and the failing lights, dimming to not much more than distant stars. A blackness overtook the building, broken only by flashes of atrocities flashing on the monitors, while the speakers blared their maddening audio in a chorus of tiny screams, while I watched a new horror unfold from my corner. There was Gary, fallen backwards onto his ass, eyes bugging out of his head, while the smiling thing parted its coat. I saw more of those twisting skeletal arms, with too many joints and too many fingers, reaching for him. I saw them clutching at his throat and limbs, dragging my screaming coworker towards the monstrous intruder, into the depths of its cloak. I saw these in bits and pieces, frame by frame, but I'll never, to the end of my days, forget the sound he made as that thing grabbed hold of him, high and desperate, drowning out the tortured bastards screeching through the speakers. He loosed an inhuman wail that was more animal than man, muffling as the curtain of fur entrapped him, and finally cut off, unceremonious and abrupt. He was just gone. The lights rose back to their proper brightness without any indication. The monitors went back to their regular screensavers, and Icky picked up where she left off, and I was left, in shock, alone with them once again, normal-sized creature. It fidgeted in its coat for a moment before extending one of its long arms to the counter and setting something on it. Then it turned and began shuffling towards the doors. I watched in open-mouthed silence as it maintained its ungainly shamble to the exit, pausing when the doors failed to open. Those glassy eyes found me where I cowered, and I was met with that same rictus of teeth, attempting to look pleasant. I rose slowly, gingerly, reaching for the switch as my blood thundered in my veins. Neither of us taking our eyes off each other, until at last my fingers brushed over the wedge key. I unlocked the door. They parted, and then Gary's abductor shuffled off into the pitch of night, with not for me, but one more of those unnerving grins. I stood there for a long time, only vaguely aware of the piss trickling down my leg, the tiny radio station blaring through the speakers. The world felt far away to me, all but the crumpled gift resting menacingly on the counter. Grim speculation hurtled through my mind, my imagination conjuring horrors from such an innocuous thing beyond anything I'd already witnessed tonight. Curiosity ultimately got the better of me, and approached the counter with dread, until I at last saw the customer gift for what it really was. Like I said, I don't work retail anymore. I much prefer the hospital. Most of the other patients are better behaved than most of the customers I used to serve. And I know it's safer, considering how they found Gary. The less said about that, the better. I will tell you that they think I did it, even though everyone and their mom asks how I got him so far, how I was physically able to do it, how I could leave him that way. I don't like those questions so much, but they don't believe me when I tell them he was bought by a monster. Some days, even I don't believe me. I mean, who would believe it when the only evidence I had to go on was a ratty $100 bill? Let me begin by saying I have had the same phone number since I got my first phone in 6th grade, and I am currently a freshman in college. So anyone who saved my phone number in 2010 has my actual phone number. That being said, I'll be honest and say that my friends and I occasionally will call old childhood friends we haven't spoken to in ages on restricted numbers and fuck with them just for the hell of it on boring Saturday nights. But this far surpasses the line of a friendly prank. I'm not exactly sure when it began, but it was during my junior year of high school. Back when I was 16, I answered every phone call and would mess with the telemarketers or strike up conversations with accidental wrong number callers. So when this unknown call came in, I thought nothing of it. But when I answered, there was nobody on the other line. I said hello a few times and asked if there was anyone there, but it was complete silence. So I simply hung up and didn't think much of it. Probably just one of my friends being dumb, which wouldn't be anything new. Only they kept calling. At first, it was once every 3 or 4 weeks during the afternoon. I would ask my friends who it was, but they would laugh and proclaim their innocence. I shrugged it off until it started happening during class. In my high school, the teachers were pretty strict about phones, unless it was during lunch. Of course, we still got away with texting and scrolling through Instagram, but a phone call in the middle of class? Not even the most lenient of teachers would allow that. One day, I got up to go to the bathroom, and on my way, I got a call from unknown. So, out of curiosity, I answered. Silence. "Hello?" I said into the phone, annoyed. At this point, it had been 2 or 3 months that I'd been getting these random phone calls. Who calls and doesn't say anything? Come on, man. After saying that, the silence broke, and my stomach dropped. On the other end of the line was just breathing. Breathing that let me know there was always someone on the other end. But at that moment, it all started to click. If one of my friends had called, it would not be silent on the other end, because 1, I'd hear the chatter of the class, and 2, if they were breathing into the phone would be completely visible to the teacher, meaning it would be confiscated. I quickly hung up, startled at my new realization. After that, the calls came much more frequently, and at all hours of the day and night, though I seldom answered it. But when I did, there was always heavy breathing on the other end. It was almost as if they were panting. Deep and heavy, like you just finished a jog. It was purely animalistic. I'd never heard this caller speak, never even knew if they spoke, until I went to a college visit on a field trip. We had just finished the campus tour and had an hour to ourselves to explore the small downtown area that surrounded the school. Me and my friend, let's call him John, were exploring the small antique shops that littered the strip. As we were between stores, I got a call. Unknown caller. I stared at my ringing phone, and I must have noticeably tensed up, because John asked me who was calling. I told him I didn't know, and he offered to answer for me. I handed over my phone and listened as he spoke. "Hello?" he started. "No, this is her friend John. She's not here right now." I watched in awe. Was the mystery caller having a conversation? "Can I ask who's calling?" John asked, and the unknown caller hung up. John shrugged, and I asked what they said, desperate for answers. "Oh, well, he asked if this was insert name here, and I said no, and when I asked who it was, he just hung up." I cannot describe the feeling of panic, dread, fear I felt at that moment. They knew my name. I told John the mystery of the caller, and he told me to tell the police. I, of course, did not listen. My father has been a cop for almost 30 years, and has instilled in his children fear of strangers and the unknown. He always stressed the importance of only giving close friends our phone numbers, not speaking to people online, talking to strangers, etc., because this had been happening for months now, and so often every week. I was scared to tell my father, and feared that I would get in trouble and get my phone taken away. Obviously, looking back, I was an idiot, but I was 16, and my entire life was my phone. So I chose to handle it on my own, and I decided to block all unknown calls. After months of torment, finally there was some silence. I had almost forgotten about the collar until the summer right after junior year, right before I became a senior. I was at my aunt's house for the weekend, and we were up at 3 a.m. telling different stories and strange encounters we've had. After hearing stories about mystery animals in the woods by her house and weird men at Kmart, I told her about the collar. She furrowed her brows and told me she didn't like that, but I showed her how I had blocked all incoming unknown callers. I then lifted the block, convinced that this anonymous guy surely must have given up after 3 months of being ignored, and we laughed it off, deciding to watch a movie to lighten the mood. Then, I shit you not, maybe 20 minutes into the move, I got a call. Unknown caller. My eyes darted to my aunt, and she stared at the phone in utter disbelief. She answered it and put it on speaker so we could both hear, but there was only silence. "Hello?" she asked. The panting began. I looked at her, fear saturating every inch of my being, and she quickly hung up. Needless to say, I put the block back on. My last encounter with him was nearly 2 years ago, and yet I still have a fear of answering unsaved numbers, and unknown callers are still blocked. I never told my father any of this, though he's retired. But because I have anxiety with almost every aspect of my life, my dad told me I need to learn how to get over some of my fears. So tonight, I'm feeling ballsy, and I've decided to lift the unknown caller ban. I am, honestly, terrified. My mom used to tell me stories about them. I'm not being vague for the sake of being vague here. They don't have a name. Or at least, my mom never gave them a name. The only way to tell them apart from the regular boogeymen haunting my dreams was the fact that they always came in threes. When I was still very young, probably too young to hear about it, she told me this story, and now I'm sharing it with you. My mom was 9 when it happened. She woke up from a nightmare in the middle of the night. Something, she couldn't remember what exactly, drew her attention to the window. She pulled the blinds apart and looked out into the street. There was a ditch across the road where the rainwater would collect. She and her sister used to play there all the time. As she was looking at it, she saw something standing on the other side of it. She never gave me a full description of what it looked like. She just said it was like a moving shadow. But the thought alone was enough to give me goosebumps every time she told the story. I'd imagine this giant silhouette with tendrils of smoke coming out of it, sharp fangs snapping open and closed, and bright red eyes. If you leave a monster to a child's imagination, it'll always become scarier somehow. "What did you do?" I asked her. "Nothing," she replied. "I just watched it, and it just watched me." There was something else I found terrifying about it. It didn't just go up to her and try to eat her. It was biding its time for some reason, waiting for something. But I'd never know what. She woke her sister up, but by the time she dragged her to the window, the figure was gone. Her sister got annoyed at her and went back to bed. My mother spent the rest of the night tossing and turning in bed, looking out the window to the empty road. A few nights later, the same thing happened, except this time, there were two figures, and they were standing on the other side of the ditch, closer to the road. This time, they weren't content to just stand there and watch. They tilted their heads side to side. I imagined jagged little movements, like hands on a clock, as they tilted back and forth. Again, by the time Mom woke her sister up, they were gone. Another few nights passed, and she woke up again. You probably know where I'm going with this by now. There were 3 figures there, and they'd gotten even closer. They were right by the road, and slowly walking across it. She said they were so close to one another that she wasn't sure where one began and the other ended, but she was so sure there were 3 of them. 3 heads, 3 creatures. They kept walking, closer and closer, and she screamed bloody murder. Her sister turned on the bedroom light, and the creatures disappeared. The very next night, she woke up, but refused to look out the window. She hid her face under her pillow and started singing a nursery rhyme to herself, hoping to keep her thoughts away from the 3 outside. Just then, when she thought she couldn't get more terrified, she heard scratching at the window. She peeked at it and saw long, thin shadows cast against the white blinds, slowly moving up and down as they scratched along the glass. She started crying, tossed her pillow at the window, and thankfully, that seemed to be enough to drive them away. On the last night, she slept in her sister's room. It was the weekend, so her parents were fine with them having a sleepover. She couldn't sleep that night, too afraid of the creatures she'd seen outside her window. She thought she'd be safe with her sister. But in the middle of the night, she heard a scream coming from her room. Her parents made it there before her, and her mom quickly covered her eyes and whisked her away as her father fell to his knees. She never knew exactly what happened to her sister, only that she was never seen again. Only that she was never seen again. "But Mom," I remember saying, "Aunt Maggie's still alive." She smiled at me grimly. I couldn't understand why. I was too young. It wasn't until I cleaned out her attic yesterday and found an old photo that I finally understood. There was a photo of her parents, Aunt Maggie and her, and a 3rd little girl who I'd never seen before. Port Alston is, or was, a small town in upstate New York with a very turbulent past. Founded by about 20 people in 1856 on the southern shores of Conesus Lake. A lot has happened here that would make you want to get the hell out of Dodge. According to Google, the town doesn't exist. Records I was able to find say it stopped existing around 1978. It's located fairly close to Geneseo, and in the 1970s, the Geneseo police would extend their services to Port Alston. There was some weird stuff going on. Here is a police transcript of the last few days. Names have not been changed to protect the innocent, as the innocent do not exist. The following conversation takes place between Officer Clarkson and Deputy Fields. 2:12 a.m., April 17th, 1978. State Route 17, town of Port Alston. Hey, Deputy Fields, are you there? Yes, officer, I'm here. Anything to report? Someone called from Port Alston. Something about a murder. Another one? That's the 5th murder this month. I'll go down into town and check on it. 5:56 a.m., April 7th, 1978. 789 Aliota Street, town of Port Alston. Deputy Fields, you've been at the house for over 3 hours without reporting. Come back to the station to report. Unknown signal static. Fields, is that you? Report to the main station in Geneseo immediately. The sheriff would like to speak with you personally. He who you seek is... Static. This is the Geneseo Police. Identify yourself and repeat what you said. He who you seek is waiting. Pick him up. Look outside. From behind Officer Clarkson. Holy hell, look behind you, Clarkson. Get down, get down. Run away. It's hit. Signal loss. So, after that, the deputy was found dead in a small apartment in Port Alston, with scratches and bruises around his wrist and back. The main street police station in Geneseo was found reduced to rubble. Livingston County officials said it was a freak windstorm that happened to hit the station. Strange streaks of blood were found in the street leading towards Port Alston. Livingston County Police were sent to patrol Port Alston. By this point, a population of 1,391. Over the course of that week, the entire town's population was found dead under the sands of Lake Conesus, and the buildings disappeared. Why did I tell you all this? Because I went there last week. I was driving to Syracuse from Geneseo, where I live, and I saw a sign for Port Alston. I was low on gas. There was an Exxon. I pulled in. The man who came to fill up my tank had red, bloody eyes. His back and wrists were scraped and bruised, and he wore a fading police uniform. He asked me one question. Why did you come here so late, Clarkson? I told you to pick me up years ago. That was enough. I had enough. I was gone, out and away. Who knew a Plymouth could go that fast? As I looked behind me, the Exxon station I vividly remember pulling into, and the town around it, was completely gone. And in its place was forest. It had to be some sick, cruel joke. It wasn't until I got back home and decided to Google Port Alston that I found out it wasn't. The man who filled my tank was Deputy Fields. The address I was at was 789 Aliota Street. I found out what happened to my father, why he never came back from the morning shift on April 5th of 1978. John D. Clarkson was dead. He wasn't transferred to Syracuse. He died. And somehow, the man I met, Deputy Fields, killed him.